Big Shaq's mother asked for a first-class seat. They laughed. They didn't know her son owned the airline. But Big Shaq didn't just want revenge. He wanted change. Now the same executives who denied her are fighting to save their careers. And Shaq? He's about to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. Power isn't about winning fights. It's about changing the game. And Shaq? He owns the whole damn court. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, passengers rushing to catch flights, announcements crackling over the intercom, and the distant hum of luggage rolling across the polished floor. Among the crowd, an elderly woman moved with quiet grace. Dressed in a simple yet elegant ensemble, her presence commanded respect without demanding it. She was Lucille Harrison, a woman of resilience and dignity. Lucille approached the check-in counter, her ticket neatly tucked inside her small leather purse. The young attendant barely looked up as she slid the ticket across the counter. "Ma'am, this is for economy class. How can I assist you?" Lucille smiled politely. "I'd like to request an upgrade to first class. I don't mind paying the difference." The attendant raised an eyebrow before glancing at her coworker, a smug smirk forming at the corner of her lips. "First class is an exclusive experience," she said, her tone neutral but laced with condescension. "It's reserved for our premium clientele." Lucille remained calm. "I understand that. I'd still like to see if there's availability." The attendant sighed, tapped a few keys on her keyboard, and shook her head. "I'm sorry, but first class is full." Lucille nodded slowly, sensing something beneath the surface of the refusal. It wasn't about availability, it was about perception. She had experienced this before, many times over the years. Subtle and not so subtle reminders that some spaces were not meant for people like her. She chose not to argue. Instead, she took her boarding pass, thanked the attendant, and made her way toward security. Behind her, the employees exchanged glances and chuckled. One of them muttered, "Some people don't know their place." Hours later, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, Big Shaq sat across from his mother, listening intently as she recounted her experience. He had just returned from a charity event, his tailored suit slightly unbuttoned at the collar. He towered over most men, his presence unmistakable. But in this moment, he was just a son, sitting beside the woman who had shaped him. Lucille stirred her tea absently, her voice even. "I didn't want to make a scene, Shaq. But the way they looked at me, the way they dismissed me, I could feel it." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Did you get the names of the employees?" She shook her head. "No. And I don't want you making a fuss about this. It's not the first time and it won't be the last." Shaq leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Ma, I own that airline. You know that, right?" Lucille chuckled softly. "Of course I know. But they don't." A moment of silence stretched between them. The weight of unspoken words settled in the air. Lucille had spent years teaching her son patience, wisdom, and restraint. But she also knew him well enough to see the storm brewing behind his eyes. "Ma," he finally said, his voice measured. "I'm not going to make a fuss. I'm going to make a change." The next morning, Shaq sat in his private office, staring at the flight logs and customer service reports of his own airline, Airlux Airways. A sinking feeling formed in his chest as he flipped through pages of discrimination complaints. Small, subtle instances that had gone unchecked. Minority passengers being questioned about their seats, frequent accidental downgrades, employees making assumptions about who deserved luxury and who didn't. His mother's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, deeply embedded problem. His assistant, Jordan Wells, knocked lightly before stepping inside. "Boss, you asked for the employee records from last night's flight." Shaq nodded, taking the folder from Jordan's hands. "I want to know exactly who handled my mother's check-in." Jordan hesitated. "You thinking of firing them?" Shaq exhaled slowly. "I'm thinking of something bigger." That evening, Shaq walked into Airlux Airways headquarters, his massive frame making the glass doors seem small. Executives and employees alike turned to stare as he moved through the building with quiet authority. Many of them still saw him as just a basketball legend, a wealthy investor, but not someone truly engaged in the business. They were about to learn differently. Inside the boardroom, a group of high-ranking executives sat around a polished oak table. At the head of the table was Oliver Crane, the CEO. A man in his late 50s, Oliver had been in the airline industry for decades. He was known for his subtle biases, never outright discriminatory, but always ensuring that power and privilege remained in familiar hands. Shaq took a seat, his expression unreadable. "I had an interesting conversation with my mother last night," he began, his voice deep and steady. "She flew Airlux, economy class, tried to get an upgrade, got denied." Oliver forced a polite smile. "Well, we have strict policies regarding upgrades, Shaquille. I'm sure it was just an oversight." Shaq's gaze was unwavering. "Was it?" A tense silence filled the room. "I've been going through the records," Shaq continued. "There's a pattern, small things. Passengers of color being subtly mistreated, downgraded, ignored. It's not official policy, but it's happening." One of the executives cleared his throat. "Surely you're not suggesting that we have a discrimination problem." Shaq placed a file on the table. "I'm not suggesting. I'm stating. And I don't think it's just a couple of employees. It's a culture problem. One that ends today." Oliver leaned back, fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. "And what exactly do you propose we do?" Shaq folded his hands. "First, I'm handling the employees involved in my mother's situation personally. But this isn't just about them. It's about leadership. We need a top-down restructuring, policy changes, mandatory diversity and inclusion training, and most importantly, consequences for discrimination. Because right now, there are none." Oliver's face tightened. "Shaquille, with all due respect, you're a businessman, but you're not an airline executive. This industry—" Shaq cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "No, Oliver, I'm the owner, and this is my airline. That means we do things differently now." The following week, a major internal audit was launched. Every executive, every employee, every policy was placed under scrutiny. Several employees were let go, not just for their behavior toward Lucille, but for a history of unchecked biases. Others were placed in mandatory retraining programs. The story of Lucille Harrison's treatment quietly leaked to the press, but Shaq never publicly confirmed it. Instead, he let the airline's actions speak for themselves. A wave of progressive changes, new policies, and a clear message that Airlux would no longer be a place for subtle racism. And as for the employees who had mocked an elderly woman at check-in, they received a letter, signed by the owner himself, informing them of their termination. No public spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet, swift justice. Lucille never asked Shaq what happened. But the next time she flew Airlux, she was escorted to first class with the respect she had always deserved. The evening sky stretched in hues of burnt orange and deep violet as the city slowly transitioned from its busy day into the stillness of the night. The private dining hall of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants was reserved under the name Harrison, though the staff and management knew exactly who would be occupying it. Big Shaq sat at the grand oak table, his hands lightly clasped, his imposing frame relaxed, but his mind anything but. Across from him, his mother, Lucille Harrison, sipped tea delicately, her movements as composed as ever. There was an elegance in the way she carried herself. Graceful, self-contained, always choosing dignity over confrontation. Lucille had been hesitant about tonight. She knew her son well enough to understand that even if he hadn't said much when she first mentioned the incident at the airport, he had absorbed every word. And with Shaq, silence was never an indication of inaction. So as they dined on finely prepared salmon and lightly roasted vegetables, she did what she had always done, prepared herself to be the guiding force that kept her son grounded. "Tell me everything from the beginning," Shaq finally said, his voice even, measured. There was no trace of immediate anger, no signs of outrage, but Lucille knew him well enough to recognize the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped subtly against the wooden table. Lucille sighed softly, setting her fork down. "It's nothing worth dwelling on, Shaquille." Shaq leaned back slightly, the weight of his presence filling the room. "That's for me to decide, Ma." There was no arguing with that. "So," Lucille told him. She told him about the dismissive way the check-in attendant had regarded her, how they had refused to even check for availability in first class. She spoke about the way they had looked at her, as though she was out of place. She spoke with the calmness of a woman who had seen and endured worse, but had long since chosen to pick her battles wisely. And yet, Shaq could hear the faint trace of hurt beneath her words. By the time she finished, he had barely touched his food. He sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, he exhaled slowly and picked up his fork. "All right." That was all he said before taking a bite of his meal. Lucille frowned slightly. "All right?" Shaq nodded, chewing thoughtfully before setting his utensils down again. "I heard you, I understand. And now I know exactly what to do." Lucille sighed, knowing better than to pry further. "I don't want you doing anything reckless, Shaquille." Shaq met her gaze. "You raised me better than that, Ma. It's not about making noise, it's about making change." She studied him for a moment before nodding in quiet approval. She had spent her life teaching him the difference between power and control. And now, as a man, he embodied both. Later that night, Shaq sat alone in his penthouse, the city stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A whiskey glass rested untouched on the table beside him, his mind too preoccupied for anything else. The incident with his mother had struck a nerve he hadn't realized was still so raw. It wasn't just about her being denied a seat in first class. It was the reminder that no matter how much success he achieved, no matter how much power he accumulated, there were still those who saw people like them as less than. And that was unacceptable. His thoughts drifted back to a time when life was much different. He saw his mother standing at the front of a small grocery store, counting the bills in her purse, trying to decide whether she could afford milk and eggs in the same trip. He remembered the store owner watching her carefully, as if she might steal something. He remembered being a child, tugging on her sleeve and whispering, "Let's just go somewhere else, Ma." But Lucille had straightened, looked that store owner right in the eye, and paid for her groceries without flinching. She had always refused to be made small. Years later, when Shaq had made his first real money, he had gone back to that same store. He had bought it outright, fired the owner, and turned it into a community market where families like his could shop with dignity, not out of revenge, out of principle. And now, his mother's quiet humiliation at an airline he owned demanded a similar response. Not with anger, not with threats, but with something far more powerful. The next morning, Shaq arrived at the Airlux Airways headquarters. The office, sleek and modern, buzzed with activity as employees moved efficiently through their daily tasks. Shaq moved through the halls with a purpose, nodding politely at the workers who greeted him, but never breaking stride. He wasn't here for pleasantries. Inside his private office, his assistant, Jordan Wells, was already waiting. Jordan had been with Shaq for years, a sharp and resourceful right-hand man who understood the way Shaq operated. He handed over a thick file. "Everything you asked for," Jordan said. "Flight records, employee reports, and customer complaints from the last 6 months." Shaq took the folder and flipped it open. His eyes scanned over pages of information, each one confirming what he had suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were repeated complaints of subtle but consistent discrimination. Minority passengers being questioned about their tickets more often than others. Frequent denials of upgrades to first class for people of color, even when seats were available. It was a quiet form of bias, the kind that left no obvious scars but cut just as deep. Shaq's jaw tightened as he closed the file. "Who's running customer service?" Jordan checked his notes. That would be Douglas Rains. Been with the company for over 15 years. Old school airline guy. Shaq nodded slowly. "Schedule a meeting, and get me the full leadership team in a boardroom by the end of the week." Jordan hesitated. "You thinking of making changes?" Shaq met his gaze. "I'm thinking of making things right." Lucille had taught him well. Power wasn't about making demands. It wasn't about shouting the loudest. True power was enforcing change without ever raising your voice. It was about reshaping the world so that no one had to experience what she had. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the decision already made. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about firing a few employees and moving on. It was about shifting an entire culture. And for that, he had all the time in the world. The first domino had been tipped. Now, it was only a matter of watching the rest fall. The corridors of Airlux Airways headquarters echoed with the quiet hum of productivity, employees clacking away at keyboards, assistants rushing from office to office with files, executives locked in silent conversations behind closed doors. Yet, despite the outward efficiency, something was deeply wrong within these walls. Big Shaq knew it, and now he had the receipts to prove it. Seated at the head of a long, polished conference table in his private office, Shaq flipped through stacks of reports. His sharp eyes scanned every page, each piece of paper confirming a pattern he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just an isolated case of discrimination against his mother. It was a systemic issue. Shaq exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the table. He had built his empire on discipline and awareness. People often underestimated him, assuming that because he had made his name in basketball, he was just another rich athlete coasting through the business world. That was their mistake. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Jordan Wells, stepped in, carrying another set of documents. "Boss," Jordan said, setting the file down. "I pulled records from the last 3 years. The numbers are ugly." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "How ugly?" Jordan hesitated before answering. "Ugly enough that if this goes public, it could be a PR disaster. Racial profiling complaints from passengers. Customer service discretionary policies that somehow always seem to disadvantage minorities. A suspiciously high number of first-class upgrade denials for Black and Latino customers, even when seats were available." Shaq clenched his jaw. He had seen enough. Shaq leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Who's in charge of customer operations?" Jordan checked his tablet. "Douglas Raines, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience. Been with the company for nearly 2 decades. Old school airline guy. And by old school, I mean, he thinks first class is meant for a certain type of passenger." Shaq finished the sentence for him. Jordan nodded grimly. "Exactly." Shaq glanced back at the reports. "And the board? Who's my biggest problem?" Jordan didn't hesitate. "Philip Lancaster, CFO. Thinks of you as a novelty owner. He's been against you since day one. He pushed back when you bought controlling shares, and he's got a tight grip on corporate decision-making." Shaq chuckled dryly. "So we've got a racist VP and a power-hungry CFO?" He shook his head. "I thought I was buying an airline. Turns out I bought a damn plantation." Jordan smirked. "You gonna clean house?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Firing people wouldn't fix the real issue. This wasn't about a few bad employees. It was about a culture of quiet exclusion. And culture couldn't just be torn down. It had to be rebuilt. Shaq had always known the value of patience. On the basketball court, he had learned to study his opponent's weaknesses, to let them think they were in control before taking over the game. Business wasn't any different. Instead of an immediate confrontation, Shaq decided on a more strategic approach. He would watch, listen, let them think he was passive. Over the next few weeks, Shaq attended executive meetings in silence, letting Lancaster and Raines run their mouths. He listened as they dismissed minor complaints about discrimination. He watched as they subtly undermined his presence in the room, treating him like an outsider despite the fact that he owned the company. During a financial review, Lancaster leaned back in his chair, glancing at Shaq with a patronizing smirk. "Shaquille, I'm sure this isn't the most exciting part of the business for you, but the numbers look solid. Maybe we should just stick to what we do best and not worry too much about political distractions." Shaq smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You mean like making sure all our customers get treated with respect?" Lancaster waved a hand. "Come on, we're an airline, not a social movement." Shaq nodded slowly. That was all he needed to hear. Later that night, Shaq sat in his penthouse, the city lights glittering beyond the window. His mind was already 5 steps ahead. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. A smooth, confident voice answered on the second ring. "Shaq, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I need a favor." The man on the other end chuckled. "You only call me when you're about to shake things up. What's the play?" Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I need a full forensic audit of Airlux's hiring and promotion history. I want customer testimonials from people who've been mistreated, and I want it done quietly. You're building a case. Shaq's eyes narrowed. I'm building a storm. Within a week, the reports started rolling in. Emails leaked from senior management showed patterns of exclusion. Minority employees were passed over for promotions. Hiring records revealed blatant disparities. And then, the biggest bombshell. An internal memo from Douglas Raines surfaced. The memo instructed customer service staff to be mindful of first-class image standards when handling upgrade requests. The unspoken message? Minorities weren't part of that image. Shaq read the document in silence, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper. He had been expecting this, but seeing it in black and white still sent a slow burn through his chest. He looked up at Jordan. Who leaked this? Jordan smirked. A few employees who've been waiting for this place to burn. They're tired of the BS. Shaq exhaled, nodding. Then let's give them what they've been waiting for. Shaq called for a mandatory executive meeting. The tension in the boardroom was thick when he walked in. Lancaster and Raines sat stiffly, their usual arrogance slightly dimmed. They knew something was coming. Shaq placed the memo in the center of the table. Douglas, he said calmly, would you like to explain this? Raines shifted uncomfortably. That's out of context. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Then put it in context for me. Silence. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. See, here's the problem. This airline isn't just a business to me, it's a legacy. And I won't have my name attached to something that treats people like second-class citizens. Lancaster scoffed. Let's not get dramatic, Shaquille. Shaq chuckled. Dramatic? No, see, dramatic would be me firing both of you right now. Raines paled. You can't. Oh, I can. And I will. But I'd rather do this the right way. Shaq sat back. I'm restructuring this airline from the ground up. New policies, new leadership, new culture, and anyone who's part of the old system. He shrugged. Well, let's just say, your golden parachutes are about to disappear. Over the next month, Shaq executed the biggest overhaul in Airlux history. Raines was quietly pushed into early retirement. Lancaster was forced out in disgrace. Shaq didn't just fire people, he rebuilt the system. He implemented diversity audits, strict anti-discrimination policies, and leadership changes that ensured equal opportunity for every customer and employee. By the time the dust settled, Airlux was no longer just another airline. It was a symbol, a statement, a legacy of change. And Big Shaq. He had proven once again that the most powerful moves were the ones you never saw coming. The night was quiet, but the digital world was about to erupt into chaos. Shaq sat in his penthouse, a glass of water on the table beside him. His laptop screen glowed in the dimly lit room, displaying a drafted post that could shake the foundation of Airlux Airways. It was a simple but damning message, paired with undeniable evidence. Leaked documents, customer testimonials, and the internal memo that reeked of racial bias. The world didn't need to hear this from Big Shaq, the owner. No, that would make it a power play. Instead, it had to come from the people, those who had experienced it firsthand. He anonymously uploaded the documents to a popular watchdog account known for exposing corporate injustices. Within minutes, the first tweet went live. Exposed. Airlux Airways discriminating against passengers of color. Leaked documents show patterns of racial bias in customer service and upgrades. Shaq watched the retweets climb from hundreds to thousands within an hour. The conversation exploded in real time. Major influencers, celebrities, and activists jumped in immediately. Some shared their own experiences, others demanded accountability. Hashtags like #Airlux exposed and #First Class for Who trended within hours. News outlets picked up the story overnight, dissecting the leaked documents. Airlux was now facing a public relations catastrophe, and Shaq hadn't even said a word yet. By the next morning, the backlash had reached unignorable levels. Passengers began canceling flights, stock prices dipped, and investors started demanding answers. Inside Airlux headquarters, the mood had shifted from arrogance to panic. Oliver Crane, the CEO of Airlux Airways, was livid. A shrewd businessman in his late 50s, Oliver had always resented Shaq's ownership of the airline. To him, Shaq was just another ex-athlete who got lucky, a temporary inconvenience who would eventually get bored and sell off his stake. But now, Oliver had bigger problems. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m. The board was demanding an emergency meeting. Major sponsors were threatening to pull their partnerships. Oliver paced his office, gripping his coffee mug tightly. How the hell did this leak? He snapped at his executive team. Nobody had an answer. This needs to go away, he said through clenched teeth. Issue a statement. Deny everything. His PR chief hesitated. Sir, with all due respect, this isn't something we can just deny. The documents are real. Oliver shot him a glare. Then we spin it. Say it's an old policy. Blame a few bad apples. Offer some meaningless initiative, diversity training or some nonsense. Just contain this. But containment wasn't an option, because the storm was already at their door. The employees who had denied Lucille Harrison her upgrade were now terrified. At first they had brushed it off, just another day at work. But now, their airline was making headlines for discrimination. And worst of all, they still had no idea who Lucille really was. Two of the check-in clerks, Lisa and Brian, sat in the break room, nervously scrolling through Twitter. You think they'll fire people over this? Lisa whispered, her voice tight with fear. Brian wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform. They're gonna find someone to blame, he muttered. I just hope it ain't us. Neither of them knew that the man who owned their fate was about to walk through the front doors. At exactly 10 a.m., Shaq arrived at Airlux headquarters. Unlike his usual presence, friendly, larger-than-life today, he was a force of quiet intensity. His tailored suit was crisp, his walk measured. He wasn't here to play nice. As he entered the building, employees stiffened. Some exchanged uneasy glances. The boss was here, and judging by the look on his face, something big was about to happen. Inside the boardroom, the entire leadership team was already assembled. Oliver sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. Shaquille, he greeted smoothly. I assume you've seen the reports. Shaq took his seat at the opposite end of the table. I have. Oliver sighed dramatically. Look, this is an unfortunate misunderstanding. We're handling it. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Handling it how? Oliver gestured to his PR chief, who nervously cleared his throat. We're issuing a public statement denying intentional wrongdoing. We'll promise an internal review, reaffirm our commitment to diversity. Shaq held up a hand. Stop. The room fell silent. Shaq leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. We're not issuing a weak statement. We're not blaming a few bad apples. We're fixing this, from the ground up. Oliver's jaw tightened. Shaquille, let's be reasonable. You own majority shares, but I run the day-to-day. I know this business. Shaq's voice remained calm. Then why is it burning down around you? A tense pause. Shaq continued, his tone even but firm. I've been watching you, Oliver. Watching how you operate. Watching how you think I'm just another ex-athlete with money to throw around. But let me be clear. I didn't buy this airline to sit back and collect checks. I bought it because I know what it feels like to be treated like you don't belong. The weight of his words settled over the room like a thundercloud. Shaq glanced at Jordan, who slid a folder across the table. In here are new policies, immediate changes. From now on, first-class upgrades are based strictly on eligibility, not image standards. Every employee will undergo anti-discrimination training, and we're implementing a passenger advisory board to ensure accountability. Oliver exhaled sharply. Shaquille, you can't just, I can, and I will. The meeting ended with one clear reality. Shaq wasn't just an owner in name. He was in control now. The next morning, Airlux released a new statement, one that didn't dodge responsibility. It acknowledged the problem, announced major reforms, and put real changes into motion. The public reaction was immediate and powerful. Instead of crumbling under the backlash, Airlux's reputation began to shift. Passengers saw real accountability, and for the first time, trust was being rebuilt. As for Oliver Crane, his influence was effectively neutralized. He still held his title, but his power had been quietly taken away. That evening, Shaq sat across from his mother at dinner once again. Lucille smiled knowingly. I saw the statement. You played that well. Shaq smirked. I learned from the best. She reached for his hand. Proud of you, son. Shaq exhaled, the tension of the past week finally easing. This isn't over yet, but it's a start. Lucille nodded. A damn good one. Outside, the city moved on, but Airlux had changed forever, and Big Shaq had made sure of it. The boardroom was unusually tense, the air thick with unspoken resistance. A long, polished oak table stretched across the room, lined with Airlux's most powerful executives. Their tailored suits and forced smiles did little to hide the underlying hostility. At the head of the table, Oliver Crane, the CEO, adjusted his tie, his usual confidence replaced with unease. Beside him, Philip Lancaster, the CFO, sat with arms crossed, his expression one of quiet defiance. They had seen the headlines. They had felt the backlash. And yet they were here to fight. At the opposite end of the table, Big Shaq sat, perfectly composed. The storm outside the company had reached its peak, but inside this room, a different kind of battle was brewing. Oliver cleared his throat. Shaquille, I think we can all agree that the recent situation has been unfortunate. Shaq didn't blink. Unfortunate is an understatement. Philip leaned forward. Look, we appreciate your concerns, but the reality is, this whole thing has been blown out of proportion. The media loves a scandal, and they're twisting things. Airlux has always prided itself on top-tier service. Shaq slid a folder across the table. Then explain this. The executives hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of documented complaints, internal emails, and direct evidence of discrimination, from denied upgrades to biased customer service interactions. And at the very top, the infamous memo from Douglas Raines, outlining how employees should be mindful of first-class image standards. Oliver paled slightly, but Philip scoffed. This doesn't prove systemic discrimination. Every company has complaints. Shaq's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it. Every company doesn't have a pattern. Every company doesn't have a policy encouraging exclusion. Oliver forced a smile. Shaquille, you're a businessman. You know how perception works. Sometimes people feel slighted when it's just a misunderstanding. Shaq leaned back, watching them carefully. They were still trying to wriggle out of this. Philip adjusted his cufflinks. We've already prepared a public statement addressing the issue. We acknowledge the concerns, but we also need to reassure our investors that this company is stable. Shaq raised an eyebrow. And by reassure, you mean sweep this under the rug? Oliver sighed. We prefer to call it protecting the brand. Shaq's fingers tapped against the table. And what about protecting the people who trust us to treat them fairly? Philip chuckled dryly. Shaq, you're thinking too emotionally. Business doesn't run on feelings. It runs on perception and profitability. Shaq's jaw tightened. There it was. Their true colors. Oliver straightened. Look, we can handle this internally. Fire a few mid-level employees, implement some diversity initiatives. The press will move on, and we'll be back to business as usual. Shaq shook his head. They still didn't get it. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, then turned it around. A live video feed appeared, showing a press conference already in progress. The company's largest institutional investors were addressing the scandal, and they weren't happy. We are deeply concerned about the recent revelations regarding Airlux Airways, one of the investors said to a sea of reporters. As major shareholders, we demand transparency, accountability, and immediate corrective actions. Oliver's face drained of color. Philip sat up straighter. How did they get involved so quickly? Shaq smirked. Because I brought them in. A stunned silence filled the room. Shaq folded his arms. See, while you two were busy drafting weak apologies, I was talking to the people who actually hold the power. Our biggest investors. And do you know what they don't like? Companies that lose public trust. Oliver's hands clenched into fists. You went behind our backs. Shaq chuckled. No, Oliver, I went ahead of you. Philip narrowed his eyes. This is a dangerous game, Shaquille. Shaq leaned forward. The only people in danger here are the ones who think they can keep running this airline like an old boys club. Oliver forced a laugh. You think you can just push us out? Shaq smiled, but his eyes were cold. No, I think you're going to push yourselves out when the board realizes you're a liability. Philip scoffed. The board won't go against us. We've been running this airline for years. Shaq's smirk deepened. And yet, here we are, in crisis mode because of your leadership. Shaq stood, adjusting his jacket. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to fix this. And if you two don't want to be part of the solution, you can be part of the resignation pile. Oliver gritted his teeth. You're making a mistake. Shaq shrugged. Maybe, but at least it's not the mistake of underestimating the wrong man. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. Oh, and one more thing, he said over his shoulder. That press conference. It's just the beginning. You might want to clear your schedules. Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving the empire he had just shaken behind him. By the time Shaq stepped outside, Airlux's stock was already fluctuating. News outlets were dissecting the investor rebellion, while employees and customers alike watched closely to see what would happen next. As he climbed into his car, Jordan Wells was already waiting inside. Jordan smirked. You just threw a bomb into the system. Shaq fastened his seatbelt. No, Jordan. I just lit the fuse. The engine roared to life, and as the car sped away, Shaq knew the real battle was just getting started. The skyline of the city shimmered under the evening lights, but inside Airlux Airways headquarters, the air was thick with unease. The backlash from the discrimination scandal had already rattled the company, and the executives believed they had weathered the worst of the storm. What they didn't know was that Shaq wasn't done yet. Sitting in his penthouse office, Big Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the financial reports on his desk. Jordan Wells, his right-hand man, stood nearby, arms crossed, watching Shaq's expression. The board still thinks they have control, Jordan said. Oliver and Philip are acting like they can stall until this all dies down. Shaq nodded slowly. Then let's make sure it doesn't. He turned his chair to face his laptop, where a major transaction was waiting for final confirmation. Over the past several days, Shaq had been quietly buying out shares from smaller stakeholders. Some were more than happy to sell, nervous about the turmoil. Others saw an opportunity to cash out big while the stock was volatile. Now, with a single click, Shaq was securing an additional 15% stake in Airlux Airways, bringing his total ownership to 60%. He exhaled, pressed the button, and confirmed the purchase. Jordan whistled. You just became the majority controller of the airline. Shaq cracked a smile. Now it's time to clean house. Shaq knew that exposing the truth had to be more than just financial moves. It had to be undeniable. He needed evidence so clear, so damning, that even the most corrupt executives couldn't talk their way out of it. That's where the recording came in. Through a carefully placed source within Airlux, Shaq had obtained an audio file from a closed-door meeting. In it, Oliver Crane, Philip Lancaster, and Douglas Rains, the same executives who had dismissed the complaints, were caught speaking freely. Their words dripped with entitlement and contempt. Philip's voice. We're running a luxury brand, not a charity. We can't just let anyone sit up front because they feel discriminated against. Oliver's voice. People love to pull the race card when they don't get what they want. If we start handing out first-class seats to anyone who whines about unfair treatment, what's next? Douglas's voice. Shaquille doesn't understand how this industry works. He thinks just because he was good at basketball he can run an airline. Let him throw his tantrum. This will blow over. Shaq listened to the recording 3 times, each time feeling the heat rise in his chest. They really think they can get away with this, he muttered. Jordan leaned against the desk. Not for long. Shaq nodded. It's time. Shaq didn't just leak the recording. He made it a spectacle. He sent the audio file to major news networks. He had the transcript printed and emailed to every major investor. And most importantly, he posted the clip himself, directly on his social media, with a caption that left no room for doubt. This is what Airlux's leadership thinks of its customers. This is why real change is coming. And this is why some people are about to lose their jobs. The internet erupted. Hashtags like #FireAirLux execs and #Shaq takes flight trended worldwide. The news cycle exploded with headlines. Shocking racist remarks from Airlux executives leaked by majority owner Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq exposes corrupt airline leadership. What happens next? Investors demand action as Airlux faces record backlash. Within hours, Airlux stock plummeted by 20%. Within a day, customers were canceling flights en masse. And within 2 days, the board had no choice but to respond. The next emergency board meeting was televised, something unheard of in the company's history. Shaq insisted on full transparency. As the cameras rolled, Oliver Crane shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was used to operating in the shadows, making decisions without public scrutiny. But today, the world was watching. Shaq, sitting across from him, was the picture of control. This board, Shaq began, his voice calm but unwavering, has failed to represent the values we claim to uphold. The people in charge have not only ignored discrimination, they have encouraged it. Philip Lancaster tried to interject, but Shaq raised a hand. "Save it," Shaq said. We all heard the recording. The room fell into stunned silence. Then, Shaq placed a stack of papers on the table. "These," he said, "are the termination notices for Oliver Crane, Philip Lancaster, and Douglas Rains." The gasps in the room were audible. Oliver shot up from his seat. "You can't do this. The board has to vote." "The board already has," Shaq cut him off. "And since I now hold majority control, let me make this official." He signed the papers in front of the cameras, each stroke of the pen marking the downfall of an empire built on arrogance. Oliver looked like he wanted to explode, but he could do nothing. Security was already waiting to escort him out. As the cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Shaq stood and buttoned his jacket. "I told you change was coming." Then, he walked out, leaving behind a company that would never be the same again. The next day, Airlux took another unprecedented step, firing the employees who had mistreated Shaq's mother on live television. At a special company-wide meeting, a representative read a statement. "As part of our commitment to real change, we are taking action against employees who have failed to uphold our values. Effective immediately, the following individuals are no longer employed at Airlux Airways." The names were read, and across social media, the moment went viral. For the first time in corporate history, a company was publicly holding itself accountable. In the days that followed, Airlux began its transformation. New policies, a diversity and ethics oversight committee, partnerships with minority-owned businesses, a push for fair hiring and promotions. For the first time, Airlux felt like a company that truly served the people. And at the center of it all, Big Shaq, no longer just a former athlete, but a leader who had rewritten the rules. The dust had barely settled, but the work was far from over. Airlux Airways had been shaken to its core. The corrupt executives had been exposed, the discriminatory employees had been fired, and the world had watched as Big Shaq tore down an outdated system that had long been left unchecked. But Shaq knew real change wasn't just about punishment, it was about building something better in its place. And so, even as headlines still buzzed with the aftermath of his corporate takeover, Shaq was already planning the next step. A week after the firings, Shaq called for a press conference, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to lay out a new vision for Airlux. The world watched as he took the podium, his towering frame exuding calm authority. Behind him, the company's remaining leadership stood not as a shield, but as witnesses to what was about to happen. Shaq adjusted the microphone. Over the past few weeks, Airlux has faced a reckoning, and rightfully so. The crowd fell silent. For too long, certain people in this company have operated under the belief that luxury is not for everyone, that some people deserve better treatment, while others are ignored or excluded. That stops now. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Shaq placed his hands on the podium, his voice unwavering. Firing a few bad actors isn't enough. If we're serious about real change, we need to rebuild this company from the inside out. Cameras flashed as he unfolded a document. Effective immediately, Airlux will be implementing 3 major reforms. Shaq took a breath and continued. First, every employee, from the boardroom to baggage handling, will undergo mandatory diversity, inclusion, and ethics training, not as a PR move, not as a checkbox, but as a fundamental requirement to be part of this company. A few journalists scribbled furiously. Others leaned in. Second, we're changing the way we hire. Airlux has long overlooked talented individuals simply because they didn't fit a certain mold. That changes today. We will actively recruit underrepresented minorities, not out of obligation, but because diversity is strength. Leadership, customer service, pilots, engineers, every level of this company will reflect the world we serve. A few gasps. Shaq saw the impact setting in. Third, he said, his voice firm, we're ensuring accountability. This company will have an independent oversight committee made up of passengers, employees, and industry professionals. Any reports of discrimination, mistreatment, or unethical behavior will be investigated, not ignored. A long pause followed. The weight of these changes wasn't lost on anyone. And then, applause. It started small, then grew, rippling through the room. Shaq didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't about applause. It was about action. As Shaq was making his announcements, Oliver Crane was packing up his office. The former CEO of Airlux had avoided the press for days. The company's board had been forced to accept his resignation. But there was no farewell party, no words of appreciation, just the cold, hard truth that he had lost. He shoved a few framed certificates into a box, his jaw clenched. He had spent years controlling this company, only to watch it slip through his fingers. And the worst part? A retired basketball player had outplayed him. The irony stung. As he walked toward the elevator, a group of employees stood watching. Some whispered. Others simply stared. The same people he had once dismissed now looked at him as nothing more than a relic of a broken system. The doors closed behind him, and with that, his chapter was over. Back at headquarters, Shaq sat in his office, reviewing a list of potential new hires for the executive team. Jordan Wells placed a file on the desk. These are the best candidates for CEO. Shaq flipped through the profiles. Former airline executives, business leaders, qualified, but all from the same mold that had created the problem in the first place. He shook his head. None of them. Jordan frowned. Then who? Shaq leaned back. He already knew the answer. A few calls later, it was official. Airlux Airways had a new CEO. And when the news broke, it sent another shockwave through the industry. Because the new CEO wasn't just another executive, it was someone who had once been ignored by the system. The day before the transition, Shaq invited his mother, Lucille, to the Airlux headquarters. She walked into the office, taking in the luxurious decor, the panoramic view of the city. It was a world she had never imagined stepping into. Shaq stood from his desk, hands in his pockets. What do you think? Lucille turned to face him. It's beautiful, but that's not why I'm proud of you. Shaq felt a lump in his throat. Why then? Lucille stepped closer, resting a gentle hand on his arm. Because you didn't do this for revenge. You did this to change something bigger than yourself. Shaq exhaled slowly, nodding. She smiled. You know, when I was sitting in that airport, being treated like I didn't belong, I never thought it would lead to this. Shaq met her gaze. Neither did they. Lucille chuckled. And look at them now. The two stood in silence for a moment, mother and son, standing at the top of an empire rebuilt on principle, not power. Finally, Shaq spoke. Come on, Ma. Let's take that first-class flight you deserve. Lucille blinked, her eyes glistening. This time, there would be no refusal. Weeks later, Airlux Airways was thriving under its new leadership. The first class wasn't just about luxury anymore. It was about accessibility, respect, and fairness. Passengers who had once felt invisible now felt valued. Employees who had once been overlooked were now leading the company. And Shaq? He had proven that true power wasn't in revenge, it was in redemption. As he boarded a flight with his mother, Lucille leaned back in her first-class seat, finally at peace. And Shaq? He just smiled, because this time he had played the long game and won. The sky stretched endlessly outside the wide, clear windows of the private Airlux jet. Sunlight painted the horizon in soft shades of gold and crimson as the aircraft cruised at 40,000 feet, higher than Lucille Harrison had ever been in her life. She sat comfortably in a fully reclining first-class seat, running her fingers along the soft leather armrest, still taking in the sheer grandeur of it all. Her son, Big Shaq, sat across from her, watching her reaction with quiet satisfaction. Lucille had been on planes before, but never like this. Never in a world where every detail, every moment, was designed for comfort, for dignity, for people who truly belonged. And for the first time, she did. A flight attendant appeared, offering warm towels and a selection of beverages. Shaq declined with a nod, but Lucille hesitated, glancing at the engraved glassware, the embroidered napkins, the polished silver tray. "Ma," Shaq said gently, noticing her hesitation. "This is for you." Lucille exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. "I still can't believe it." Shaq leaned back, his massive frame relaxed but his eyes focused, thoughtful. "Believe it." She reached for the warm towel, gently pressing it against her hands. "It's not just the flight, Shaquille. It's everything." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the son she had raised through hardship, through struggle, the son who had defied every single expectation the world placed on him. And now, he had rewritten the rules altogether. Lucille's gaze softened. "Shaquille, do you remember when you were 7 and you told me you wanted to be the biggest man in the world?" Shaq smiled, the memory flickering in his mind. "I meant physically back then." Lucille chuckled, shaking her head. "You were already tall for your age, but that wasn't what you meant, not really." She set the towel aside, folding her hands together. "You wanted to be big enough to change things, to make life better for people like us. And you have, son." Shaq looked away for a moment, staring out the window. The clouds drifted below them, as if the past itself was floating beneath their feet. "I wanted to fight back," he admitted. "For you. For all the times you had to stay silent. For all the times people looked right through you." Lucille nodded, but her eyes were knowing. "And you did. But tell me, Shaquille, did you win because you fought?" Shaq frowned slightly. Lucille reached over and took his hand. Her grip was firm, steady. "Power isn't about winning fights, son. It's about changing lives." Shaq let those words sink in. It wasn't about taking down corrupt executives. It wasn't about forcing people out. It was about building something that would outlast him. And he had. As the jet sailed across the sky, Shaq's mind drifted back through the years. A young Shaquille, barely tall enough to reach the counter, watching his mother struggle to count change at the grocery store. The pain of hearing her whispered apologies when they had to put things back. The first time he felt the sting of being looked down on. Not because of his height, but because of who he was. His first basketball game, where a coach told him, "You can't just be big, you have to be better." The moment he got his first contract, when he promised his mother she'd never have to struggle again. And then, the moment he realized money alone wouldn't change the world. Each memory was a thread, weaving together the man he had become. Lucille saw the emotions flicker across his face. "What is it?" Shaq exhaled. "Just thinking." She smiled knowingly. "About the past?" He nodded. Lucille squeezed his hand. "Don't forget to think about the future, too." A soft chime interrupted the moment as the flight captain's voice came through the speaker. "Mr. O'Neill will be descending soon. Your CEO is waiting at the destination to greet you." Shaq smirked. "Perfect timing." Lucille tilted her head. "Your new CEO?" Shaq nodded. "You'll like this one." As the jet landed on a private runway, a few high-level Airlux staff members stood waiting. Among them was a man in a tailored navy blue suit, his posture confident but respectful. Lucille studied him as they approached. "He looks familiar." Shaq grinned. "That's because you met him before, a long time ago." The man stepped forward and extended his hand to Lucille. "Mrs. Harrison," he said warmly, "it's an honor to see you again." Lucille blinked, searching his face. Then, suddenly, realization dawned. Years ago. at a small grocery store. Lucille had met a young man who worked as a cashier, struggling to make ends meet. That day, she had seen him argue with a manager over being mistreated. She had given him kind words, a quiet strength that helped him push forward. And years later, he was now the CEO of Airlux Airways. Lucille covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, my dear boy." Shaq watched as the two exchanged a moment rooted in something far greater than business. It was proof, real proof, that change was possible. As they walked towards the car waiting for them, Lucille turned to her son. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said softly. Shaq chuckled. "That I picked the right man for the job?" She shook her head. "That this isn't just your story anymore. It's bigger than you. Bigger than me." Shaq nodded, taking in the weight of her words. Lucille smiled. And that's the kind of legacy that never dies. As the car pulled away, the world outside continued to move forward. But in that moment, in that car, Shaq and his mother knew. They had already arrived. In the weeks that followed, Airlux flourished under its new leadership. Passengers began noticing the shift, from better service to fairer policies. Employees who had once been ignored were now thriving in roles they never imagined possible. Shaq had built an empire not based on power, but on purpose. And as he sat in his office weeks later, looking out at the horizon, he knew the best was yet to come. Some people fight battles, others change the battlefield entirely. Shaq had done both. And this was only the beginning. The early morning hum of Airlux International Airport was different now. The tension that once lurked in its corridors had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that this was a place for everyone. From the newly redesigned customer service counters to the diverse range of employees assisting travelers, change wasn't just a promise, it was visible. And at the center of it all, Big Shaq. It had been 6 months since Shaq took full control of the airline, and in that time, Airlux had gone from a company on the brink of collapse to a symbol of real progress. Customer satisfaction had soared. No longer were upgrades based on bias or outdated policies. Every traveler had a fair shot at luxury. New hiring practices had reshaped the workforce. For the first time in the company's history, the leadership team reflected the diverse communities it served. Revenue was stronger than ever. The public had embraced the airline's transformation, leading to record-breaking ticket sales. And yet for Shaq, it was never about the money. As he sat in his office, looking at the reports, Jordan Wells leaned against the desk, a smirk on his face. "Admit it," Jordan said. "You did it." Shaq chuckled. "We did it." Jordan shook his head. "Nah, man, you let it. And now, this airline is what it always should have been." Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, but there's one last thing I need to do." The airport had changed, but Shaq knew he needed to see it with his own eyes. Dressed in a sharp but understated suit, he walked through the same airport terminal where everything had started. The last time he had been here, his mother had been humiliated. This time, she walked beside him, not as a passenger overlooked, but as the mother of the man who had changed everything. Lucille Harrison smiled as she observed the changes, staff greeting every passenger with warmth, travelers of all backgrounds moving freely without second glances. She turned to Shaq, her eyes shining. "You really did it, son." Shaq gave a small nod. "We're getting there." Lucille touched his arm. "Number you got there." As Shaq walked towards Gate 42, the same gate where his mother had once been denied dignity, he stopped for a moment. Looking around, he took in the sight of passengers boarding a flight, employees assisting them without judgment. This wasn't about basketball. It wasn't about fame, or power, or proving people wrong. It was about leaving something behind that mattered. And as Shaq turned and walked toward the exit, a new chapter began. Not for him, but for everyone who would come after. The story didn't end with victory. It ended with impact. And that was bigger than anything Shaq had ever achieved on the court. This isn't just a story. It's a movement. Big Shaq didn't just fight for justice. He changed the game. And now it's your turn to be part of something bigger. Have you ever faced unfair treatment while traveling? Have you witnessed a moment where someone stood up and made a difference? Your voice matters. Share your experiences, join the conversation, and help shape a world where everyone gets the respect they deserve. Follow us for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and game changers who are rewriting the rules. Because in the end, power isn't about winning fights. It's about changing lives. Let's keep the momentum going. Join the movement. Be part of the change.